So just as a reminder, before we start the module and the chapter on printmaking, there is a link on the course schedule that I want you to check out. It's a short article at the Met Museum website where you're going to see examples of various types of printmaking. You'll be able to see them up close, very short text related to that too. So you can read that whenever you wish, watch the lecture first, and then check that out if you want. Or before you forget, click on the link in that document on Canvas and go take a look at it now. Okay. Printmaking. If you have ever accidentally tracked mud in your house on the bottom of your tennis shoes, then you have a basic understanding of the principle behind making prints. So think about it. You stepped in some mud. Some of it stuck to the raised surfaces of your tennis shoes. When you stepped on the floor, the pressure of your weight transferred the mud from the bottom of your shoes to the surface of the floor, leaving a footprint, right? If you took a second step, that next footprint was probably a little bit fainter because there wasn't as much mud left on the base of your shoes, right? You'd have to step in the mud again to make a print as dark as the first one, okay? And with a little bit of practice, you might be able to make a row of sneaker prints that were almost exactly identical. All right, so let's translate that picture in our minds into the language of printmaking. All right, so the sole of your shoe, which is the sort of the irregular surface that holds the mud, right? That is the equivalent of what we would call the matrix in printmaking, the matrix. This is a surface on which a design is prepared before being transferred through pressure onto the surface of a piece of paper, okay? A matrix. Now, that printed image that is transferred is called an impression. So we can think about pressure and pressing the image into the surface of the paper. So two terms, a matrix is where the design is located, and an impression is the printed variation of that design. Okay? So an artist makes a matrix in order to create prints from it. And a single matrix can be used to make many impressions, almost all of them identical, which is the point, right? And all of them considered original works of art. In general, there are two things that distinguish artist prints from mass-produced commercial prints. One is that the artist has a hand in creating or oversees the process of the print and also inspects those prints for quality. The second thing is that there may be a declared limit to the number of impressions made. This is also known as an edition. And these are signed and numbered by the artist. So once the entire edition is printed, approved, signed, and numbered, the printing surface is canceled. So the matrix is canceled by scratching or gouging into it so it can't be used again. And that's what keeps the edition number limited, right? The guarantee that no more can be made from that same matrix. So if we look at the example that's on screen right now, we have the print in the center, and then below that, there's some text written. And each of these things means something in particular and is usually located in the place where we see it now. So bottom left of the image itself, we see two numbers, a number and then a slash and then a larger number, 1/50. So what that means, that refers to the number of the edition. There are a total number of 50 prints in the edition of this image, and the one that we're looking at here is number 1 out of those 50. The next notation underneath it is usually the title, if the maker decides to include that or if there is one. And then at the very end is the artist's signature. Okay? If the print is so large that we don't see a white border around it, as we do in this case, then you might look on the back of the print for the same information. There's one different designation that I just want to point out that you might come across. Where we see the edition number here, that is 1 out of 50, you might see letters or initials that represent different things. So I want you all to know about the term AP that could be located here. And AP is, instead of an edition number, it relates to the artist's proof. So AP means artist proof. And that just means that there's something different about that print that distinguishes it from the rest of the edition. Okay, but prints were made for more than 1,000 years before these standards were set into place. So 3 historical methods for printmaking or for artist prints are intaglio, relief, and lithography. Okay? These were joined by a more contemporary method called screen printing in the 20th century. And then digital printing in the 21st. And we'll take a look at each of those methods and some innovative ways in which contemporary artists are using print processes today. Printed pictures were developed in China in the 9th century. By the 11th century, they had what was called movable type. The technologies for both printmaking and paper making, handmade paper that is, came to Europe from China. First, as a way to meet the demand for inexpensive religious icons and playing cards. So here we see that printmaking arises out of a need to be able to widely distribute something, to make something available to a large number of people. And in this case, in the early case, inexpensive religious icons and playing cards were what was needed. Then later, it evolved to add illustrations to books that were made with the new movable type, which was developed in 15th century Europe. So the first printed books made with movable type is another sort of landmark moment within printmaking. But as recently as the late 19th century, printmakers were still needed to make copies of drawings, paintings, and even early photographs by making plates to be used along with movable type for illustrating newspapers and books. However, as photomechanical methods for reproduction were developed in the later 19th century, handwork started to play a decreasing role in the printing process. And what we'll see is that it's gone through different phases. Lithography and intaglio and relief, they do have their grounding in the history of printmaking, but there are many artists who use these methods today in contemporary ways or as a way to reflect the relevance of those historic ways of working. Why do artists make prints? Well, they're less expensive than paintings or sculptures, so they can be purchased by a wider group of viewers. For the same reason, it's an easy way to influence social change through wide distribution in comparison to a unique work of art like a painting or a sculpture. And there's also the element of the artist who, as a maker, is just fascinated with process and with craft. And there's certainly a lot of that complexity in printmaking. So it's just about the making and all of the different stages involved in that. So relief prints then. The example that we gave was the dirty shoes on the kitchen floor, but you could also think of your fingerprint or rubber stamps. You could also think of wet tires running across the road. So this is a raised surface that transfers an image to another surface. Some of the tools that are used by artists are gouges, knives, and chisels. Okay, so woodcut, right? So one type of relief printing process is a woodcut. In this case, the artist creates the matrix by cutting away, leaving a design in relief on the wood plate. This process lends itself to a strong and a bold black and white contrast. So it has a signature look for that reason. For the same reason, it does not easily lend itself to color. And in terms of this ability to recreate multiples of it, woodblock printing is limited to, at max, a couple hundred within the edition due to deteriorating edges from the pressure of the press. So wood is a organic material and it gets compressed over time. And as it's run through the press, it gets smushed, right? And so that can shift the look of the carved design. This is a process that flourished in Japan in the 17th to 19th centuries. Japanese woodblock prints were made through a complicated process that included multiple blocks to achieve subtle and highly integrated color effects. Because they were much cheaper than paintings, these prints were a preferred art form for middle-class people who lived in the capital city of Edo, which is today known as Tokyo. The subject matter for Edo prints included famous theater actors, nightlife, landscapes, and even erotic pictures. Japanese prints were among the first objects of Asian art to find favor among European artists, and many painters in the late 19th century were strongly influenced by them, and we've seen that already in some of the work of the post-impressionists, Gauguin, for example, Van Gogh, for example. So what we're looking at here is Hiroshige's Light Rain at Shono. This print required 4 blocks. in order to make it, one for each color. Okay, so each new color would require a separate block run through the press. The process of making sure that all of those plates line up with each other and they're all printed in a way that looks uniform throughout the print and in a way that puts the color where the artist wanted it. That's a pretty exact process, and that's called registration. So you want to make sure that the blocks themselves land in the same place each time they're run through the press. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner's port scene is an image that is quite different from the Hiroshige that we were looking at. It's different in several ways. One, in which it's only black and white, and second, is that it's fairly abstract in comparison to the Hiroshige print, right? It's almost indecipherable at first. The title kind of helps us to understand what we're looking at here, but it does depict a harbor with sailboats that are casting shadows across the water, large triangular shapes that sort of pull downward within the composition. You can actually, if you look closely, see the texture of the matrix in this work, because the artist seems to have gouged or even hacked away almost at the wood to make the white areas. I think especially in the upper left corner, if you take a look there, you can see these little broken pieces of black. It's almost like a chattery kind of look in most of the white areas, these tiny little areas of black. That would have been an irregularly carved surface, or a gesturally carved surface, leaving a little bit of the matrix behind that catches some ink. So it's not a pure white shape there, okay? Because most of the strokes go vertical, and because the wood block itself has a direction to the grain, we could assume that the grain of this wood block was probably also vertical when he made the print. We can assume that because it would have been a more fluid carve to go with the grain rather than across the grain. And to kind of help understand that a little bit more so, we're looking at some examples of wood carving gouge types. There are ones that look like a U, there are ones that look like a V, there are ones that are for detail work, and there are ones that are for larger areas of removing the material. And then there are some that go shallow and some that go deep, but the artist can also affect this by the angle with which they hold the gouge. Right, so Kirchner's direct and expressive approach amounted really to a revolt against the highly polished and subtle effects of many other European printmakers that we're seeing this at this time. So there's a standard in European printmaking that's about the fineness of craft and detail and the cleanness of the image in a way. And this one's much more expressive. And we'll come to understand why that's important for Kirchner's work in a little bit. So this is a good place to pause. If you want to get a better understanding of all the terms that have suddenly landed in your lap with just these few short slides, then take a look at the supplemental videos where you can see a demonstration of Kirchner's process in particular, and how color and registration works when making a woodblock print. So another type of relief printmaking is wood engraving. This is traditionally used for book illustration, and we're looking at an example by William Blake here on screen now. This would have been engraved with a similar set of metal tools, and those metal tools allow for a finer degree of detail in the resulting carving. English artist William Blake was one of the early pioneers of this medium. He illustrated the book Thornton's Pastorals of Virgil in 1821 with a series of wood engravings. The book is a collection of ancient Roman poems extolling the virtues of rural life. One of Blake's illustrations is boy returning joyfully with a plow and oxen. Here we see some herders going home at sunset. We also see the high detail that's possible through the use of these engraving tools. The artist's fine white gouges go with nearly equal ease in all directions, showing the lack of grain in the dense wood that is stood upright usually for carving. Blake made the brighter areas by carving with deeper gouges. Lino cut is also a relief printing technique, but it has a different matrix. This is a synthetic linoleum surface. So because linoleum is really, really soft, it's much easier to carve than wood. It also results in some differences in the way the print looks, right, or the way the impression looks. There's no grain, and the linoleum can be cut with equal ease in any direction. So subtle details in linoleum cuts are a little easier to make than they are in woodblock prints. But the softness of the linoleum also limits the number of crisp impressions that can be made because the block wears down so easily. So the softer the medium, the easier it is to carve, the easier it is to get sort of finer detail. However, you can't make as many prints because because the carving flattens out and gets distorted much more quickly due to the pressure of the press. Elizabeth Catlett in I Have Special Reservations. We can take a look up close at this image and see soft, even white areas created by the gouges. The strokes go in every direction, reflecting the lack of the grain of wood. This is a really beautiful example of socially conscious printmaking as it highlights the issues of race segregation, which was still practiced at the time that the artist made this print. She says of this work, I wanted to show the history and the strength of all kinds of Black women, working women, country women, great women in the history of the United States. So this is one work in a series that Catlett made called The Negro Woman. The narrative series of prints embodies the first person perspective of Black women, and it gives us a sense of intimacy and also resilience as the viewer navigates a variety of images relating to the ongoing struggle for racial justice that they depict. Special reservations of the title refers to the segregation of public transportation that was legal in the United States until 1956. This is a black and white lino cut of 4 passengers on a bus. The first bus seat in the foreground has a colored only sign at the top of it. There are 4 unidentified women seated behind the sign, and the central woman in front is wearing a textured jacket. The title is handwritten in graphite below the image, and the work is signed. Letterpress printing is a process in which raised ink surfaces, usually made of wood, metal like lead, or linoleum, are pressed onto paper. This practice is essentially the same method of relief printing that was invented in the 15th century by Johannes Gutenberg, using movable type, hand-carved blocks, and hand-cranked printing presses. The designs are carved on wood blocks, and they are combined with movable letters of wood or metal. And we can see that happening here in the upper left-hand image, directly under letterpress printing. You can see an artist at work making a carving. Below that is the interior of a letterpress shop in Nashville called Hatch Showprint. Okay, so the letters in letterpress printing are positioned backwards, as is any imagery. And then they're locked into what's called a frame or a chase, which is secured in the printing press and then inked. The paper is pressed onto the ink type to obtain an impression that is right reading. So when you run it through the press, what looks backwards in the chase looks right reading in the print. Okay. Posters with more than one color require separate assemblages or forms for each color. And each application of additional color requires a new pass of the same paper through the press. So I want to talk a little bit about Hatch Showprint. It's an old-fashioned letterpress shop that has been making entertainment posters or show posters in Nashville, Tennessee since 1879. It's currently operated in a relatively new location in the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. Hatch is still in active business, still printing and designing posters that are distinctive and eye-catching, a happy result of pressing hand-inked, hand-carved wood blocks, type, and metal prints onto paper, combined with the artistic flair and the talent of Hatch's craftsmen and craftswomen over the years. Small letterpress print shops in general are popular for custom designed invitations, greeting cards, posters, calendars, and notepads. These tend to be functional items and also decorative as well, including book arts, graphic design, and illustration. Letterpress today is being made as an art form as well, and an important letterpress artist to know about is Amos Paul Kennedy Jr. He's an American printer, book artist, and papermaker who's best known for social and political commentary, particularly in printed posters. One critic noted that Kennedy is unafraid of asking uncomfortable questions about race and artistic pretension. Kennedy creates prints, posters, and postcards from hand-set wood and metal type. He uses oil-based inks and eco-friendly and affordable chipboard. Many of the posters are inspired by proverbs, sayings, and quotes that the artist locates or potential clients will provide to him. Using hand presses, he produces large editions of wildly colorful, typographically driven posters on inexpensive chipboard stock. Posters which are often so riotously layered in vibrant colors of ink as to retain a wet iridescence and tackiness even years after they were printed. Oil-based inks take a while to dry. So these are so layered that they could stay tacky and still not completely dry years after they're printed. His working method often involves overprinting multiple layers of text, resulting in no two prints being truly identical. I think you can see this clearly in all of these prints, but particularly in the one that has more of a reddish tone, all the way to the left-hand side of your screen. You can start to see the way the transparency of the ink reveals multiple passes through the press. Many pieces of the typography lay over each other. There's this beautiful kind of glazing transparency of the color that happens as well. A labor-intensive process. A contemporary artist who uses relief techniques in an original way is Betsy Romero of Mexico City. She buys used tires with the tread almost gone, and she carves into them some relief patterns that are based on traditional Mexican popular culture motifs, such as skeletons and flowers. The tires are easily inked for printing on long sheets, which she either sells by the yard or exhibits together in an installation type format with the tires themselves. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about a different printmaking process now called intaglio. Intaglio is different from relief printing in that it is the area below the surface that holds the ink. The word intaglio comes from the Italian word intagliare, to cut into, So here's what the process of making an intaglio print is like. The printed image is cut or scratched into a metal surface. Sometimes that can also be plexiglass. So it's important to see that the difference here is that the part that will print is the part that is carved out. Okay, so in order for that to happen, the printmaker first rubs the plate with printer's ink, and then with a clean cloth wipes that surface clean very carefully, leaving only ink in the etched or the grooved part of the plate. Then dampened paper is placed on the inked plate, which then is passed through a press, right? The pressure of the roller, it creates a characteristic plate mark around the edges of the image. And so this is really one of the distinguishing characteristics of intaglio printmaking, is the way the plate mark and the pressure of the press leaves an indentation around the edges of the image. Intaglio printing was traditionally done from polished copper plates, but now zinc, steel, titanium, aluminum, and even plastic are often used. Engraving and dry point and etching are the principal intaglio processes, and we'll look at some of the differences between those two things. One of the greatest Renaissance printmakers was Albrecht Dürer. Although he considered himself primarily a painter, it was printmaking that brought him the most fame, and his prints also brought him steady income. He made these prints so expertly crafted and sophisticated that they have become known as master engravings. To the left of that is a little diagram that helps us to maybe understand a little bit better the way the ink sits in the recessed portions of the plate and the way the paper and the pressure of the roller create the impression. Engraving processes like Dürer is the oldest of the intaglio processes, and it comes from the medieval practice of incising linear designs into armor and other metal surfaces. The process of making an etching begins with the preparation of a metal plate. So again, in the supplemental videos, if you want to pause now just to get a visual on what this all looks like, there is a demonstration for you in the supplemental videos. So the artist paints the surface of a copper or zinc plate with a coating of either wax or varnish that will resist the acid. So etching, we have a prepared plate, metal plate again. We have a coating that will protect certain portions of the plate from an acid bath, which is what will actually do much of the work of the etching on the plate itself. So the artist will easily draw through the ground or the protective coating of wax with a pointed tool, and this will expose the metal with each stroke, right? So an etching tool can be thick, like a ballpoint pen, but it's more often than not closer to something kind of needle-like and relatively sharp. Finally, the plate itself is immersed into an acid bath. Acid bites, quote unquote, into the plate where the drawing has exposed the metal. So the metal becomes vulnerable to the acid, but again, that protective wax will block out other parts. Finally, the plate is immersed in nitric acid. Acid bites into the plate where the drawing has exposed the metal, making a groove that will vary in depth according to the strength of the acid and the length of time the plate is in the acid bath. Because they are more freely drawn than engravings, etched lines are generally more relaxed or more irregular is another way to think about it, maybe more gestural than engraved lines are. So this is an important visual distinction between the two processes. And we can see the difference in line quality between an etching and an engraving when we look at these two, the one by Rembrandt on the left side of your screen, and then the detail of the Dürer, where you can see all that lovely texture a lot more easily and more clearly. Okay, so if we compare the two, we can see how the line work in Dürer's engraving are highly precise, both in terms of their spacing and the direction and how that relates to the form. In Christ Preaching, Rembrandt's expression of Christ's compassion harmonizes with a kind of delicate but also decisive quality to the artist's etched lines. This etching shows Rembrandt's typical use of a wide range of values, mostly created through hatching, right, through hatching. Skillful use of light and shadow draws the attention of the viewer to the figure of Christ and gives clarity and interest to the whole image. So if we just think about the use of value in this composition, in a composition in which each figure is similar in size, Rembrandt identified Christ as the key figure by setting him off with a light area below the figure, but also a light vertical band above the figure and implied lines of attention that lead to Christ through the faces of his listeners. I want to draw your attention to some of the subtleties of describing characters that are actually in shadow. So we do focus our attention on Christ because he's the standing figure, because we recognize the iconic image of him, because of all the contrast that is around him in terms of light and dark areas. But also because the other figures in this composition are relatively subdued in contrast. So I'm particularly amazed in this print by the figures that are in shadow. We can still see their expressions. We can still get a sense of their character. And there's such a subtle drawing that's happening there. Another intaglio process is called dry point. Similar to line engraving, except that the cutting tool in this case is called a dry point needle. This is a tool with a steel or a diamond tip, usually used on a soft copper or a zinc plate. The artist draws on the plate almost as freely as you would on a piece of paper with a pencil. As the needle scratches, the displaced metal leaves a little bit of a burr or a rough edge. And if that burr is left on the plate, it will create a slightly blurred line when printed. The burr can also be brushed away, which will result in a finer, more delicate line. This is another one of those cases where the pressure of the press will cause that burr to wear down very quickly. So it's very rare that prints will be made only using the dry point process. Usually those would be small additions if they were. Most often dry point is used to fill in details of etchings. So if we look at this image by Mary Cassatt, we can see that some lines have a distinct quality and others have a velvety kind of appearance. Take a look at the child's arm and also the mother's hair. These lines are places where the burrs have not been removed from the plate. And the scraped lines that we can see are crisper and their edges are more easily distinguished. So in general, dry point has a scratchy quality that makes subtle variations in value possible. And we can see that pretty beautifully in the hair, also the neck, and some of the darker areas of both the arms of the mother and of the child as well. Etching yields only lines. That's something we've talked about sort of exclusively up to this point. But there is a way to create shaded areas in an intaglio matrix. One of the ways to create shading would be with lines, and we've talked about the technique of hatching and cross-hatching. So multiple lines that are closely spaced or that overlap each other are ways to add value to a drawing with line. But there's another process called aquatint that can be used in an etching to create gray areas when a print would otherwise be only about black and white. Those gray areas can also be used to make color prints as well. So we'll talk a little bit about the aquatint process. In aquatinting, the artist sprinkles an acid-resistant powder onto the plate over the parts that need the gray tone. Okay, so when the plate is bathed in acid, the exposed areas between the powder particles are eaten away to produce a roughened surface that's capable of holding some ink. So here we have a powder, so that fine texture, powdery texture, think of that. That's what resists the acid. So when the plate is put into the bath, the subtle exposed parts appear very textural, right? Because the powder itself is blocking some of that acid from etching away on the plate. Values produced this way can vary from light to dark, depending on how long the plate is in the acid and how thick the dusting of powder is. So there's a great amount of control here and a great amount of the ability to visualize a few steps ahead in the process, what this is going to look like based on how you use the aquatint powder and how much time you keep the plate in the bath. Because aquatint is not suited to making thin lines, it's usually combined with a linear print process such as engraving or etching. So white is where the plate has been protected from the acid. We're looking at a beautiful example by Goya, and it's called "And So Was His Grandfather." And the subject, rather humorous, rather satirical. We've got a donkey looking at a book full of donkeys as though it was a scrapbook, right? So you can put that together with the title and see some of the humor or the sarcasm or the satire at play here in this Goya. In any case, a lot of aquatint being used. Take a look at the tone of the background. The areas that are white are the areas where the plate has been most protected from the acid. The darkest values are the deepest bite of the acid. In other words, the plate has spent the longest amount of time in the acid bath there. So there's more of the material that is eroded away by the acid. And the graininess and the very distinct tonal areas of the print are typical of the textural look of aquatint. And if you think about grains of the aquatint powder or grains of resin being used in the process, you can kind of see how that grainy texture reflects the materials that are being used to create it. So aquatint, beautiful way to create tone in an otherwise linear-based print, tone meaning gray areas, multiple shades of gray in an otherwise black or white print. And so we just want to look at another example by Mary Cassatt. There is intaglio techniques, a few of them that are being combined in this work. So just to show that knowing each of these techniques is a way to get a wider range of expression of mark making in the printmaking process. So Cassatt made the colored areas with aquatint. She scratched the lines into the surface of the plates with dry point, and she used 3 plates to make this print. 1 plate would be passed through the press for each color. Unlike relief and intaglio processes, the print process of lithography requires no cutting into the matrix. So the term for this is planographic. The matrix surface is flat. There's no carving in it. There's no relief in it, okay? It is a faster and more flexible process than the others we have discussed. This is a process where the artist draws on Bavarian limestone or plate without cutting. They use lithographic crayons or pencils, which are a waxy kind of pencil, or also something that is called tuche or liquid, a tuche liquid. Right? The leading European printmaker of the late 19th century, Toulouse-Lautrec, created many of his most innovative works using lithography. The freedom and the directness of the technique made it ideal for his spontaneous and his witty approach to his subjects. In the space of about 10 years, he created hundreds of posters that advertised everything from nightclub acts to bicycles. His use of bright colors and flattened modern composition also influenced graphic designers of the future and for several decades. Toulouse-Lautrec had a fruitful and long-lasting friendship with the cabaret singer Aristide Bruant. In this portrait print of his friend, we see the artist's creative use of the lithographic medium. He used crayons of various widths for the lines and tusch for the solid dark areas. He created the white patches at the right by dropping melted wax onto the stone, keeping ink away from that part. The speckles were created by spattering, and he flicked the bristles of an inky brush to create that effect. Most of the books and pictures that are printed today are printed with a version of lithography called offset printing or offset lithography. Each page image is burned onto a metal lithographic plate, and then that is inked. But the ink is first transferred or offset onto a rubber cylinder before printing on paper. This method, which is really suited to rotary presses, gives a uniform ink depth across an entire printing. It's used for the print version of your textbook and many others. A stencil is a sheet with a design cut out of it. It can be made from any number of different materials. You use the stencil as another way to make repeated versions of an image. Painting over the stencil will transfer the design, the cutout design, to the picture plane. This is a quick way to make multiple images within a work of art or multiple works of art. Stencils are a favorite method of street artists, and it's a favorite of theirs because they permit a fast application, quick fabrication without the need to redraw every time. One such work, Banksy, if you know the work of Banksy, oftentimes will include the use of stencils in the making of that work. A few stencil artists make objects of a more subtle design, and one of those is Kim McCarthy, whose work we're looking at on screen now. Her Urban Buddha shows many repeated patterns in the background that she achieved with stencils using blue and green paint. The black skulls and the dominant Buddha images were also sprayed through stencils. So you can see the kind of graphic or shape-based quality to those stencil parts, right? So the drawback then of using stencils is that only positive and negative spaces are produced. Shading is not possible or not very easy. McCarthy overcame the difficulty of shading or not being able to use shading to create her image by adding many colors, by using brushstrokes in a really painterly way, and also by using paint drips in a painterly way. So the trails of black and white paint are not only expressive of mark making, but they also suggest a really quick execution that is pretty typical of street art. Screen printing, also known as silkscreen, is a term that comes from the traditional use of silk as the material for making the image. So we have a stencil that is adhered to a screen in this process, and we have a squeegee or a rubber-edged blade that pushes ink through the fabric into the open areas of the stencil. This is a process that's really good for producing uniform areas of color. We don't get the same kind of reversal of the image that we do in other printmaking processes. It is really popular in graphic design and in poster making. It lends itself to poster production or many, many multiples. But I've also seen students here at Tech actually use it to make posters for the student show, or right now they're making new t-shirts with that involve the new logo for the School of Design. So you can screen print on a t-shirt, on a handkerchief, on a tote bag, on socks, on just about any material that you can think of. And so for that reason, this is another type of process that's really popular with social movements. They use this process to help spread the word. And the work that we're looking at on screen right now by Jesus Barraza is one such example of that. This is a portrait of the climate activist, Milan Lake, and a quote from one of her essays. This is an excellent example of the graphic quality of screen printing. Each one of the different colors in this print would have been created with a different pass through of the squeegee. With industrial versions of all forms of printmaking, including engraving, lithography, and digital printmaking, images can be printed on almost every imaginable surface around us, including balloons, clothing, ceramics, packaging, textiles, wallpaper, decals, electronics, everything. And so maybe it comes as no surprise then that artists are looking for ways to use this process more innovatively. And one of the ways they do that is to take printmaking into the 3D realm as well. Artist Callie Curry, also known as Swoon, takes printmaking outdoors as well. Swoon makes large lino cuts and wood cuts on lightweight paper. She cuts the images from paper and pastes them up on urban walls and on barriers all across the city. For me, she says, pasting is about many things. And one of them is about declaring the wall of the city as a space for our dreams, our desires, and our collective identity. I see these walls as reachable at the ground level and seeable by the masses. It's a bulletin board for millions of voices that need an outlet, including mine. There's a sentiment in that statement, I think, that really reflects the historical significance of printmaking as something that can speak to a wide audience, a broad audience, can spread messages pretty quickly, and it's accessible to a lot of people. It's not something that's isolated in the gallery or something that only the wealthy can afford. So it's much more democratic in that sense. Its function as raising social awareness is still at the heart of many works by contemporary printmakers today. Even as computer-generated digital printing and 3D printing techniques and new materials provide artists with a means of pushing the boundaries of printmaking and experimenting with prints in 3 dimensions, we still see artists working with the traditional aspects of printmaking today as well. So Swoon began her work as a street artist, but a gallery owner happened to notice and invited her to create an installation in their gallery. And since then, many other museums and galleries have also followed suit. Her prints and her installations can be seen both indoors and outside on walls throughout the world. All right, so I'm going to leave you. This is the end of our chapter on printmaking. It's a very quick overview of a very interesting and labor-intensive process. So I just want to give you a little bit of an idea of how to sort of categorize all the different processes in your mind. And so this is a slide that's kind of like a summary of everything. Possibly help you with a way to organize the information in this chapter in your own brain.